Well, if everything goes like clockwork.
A team of specialists defeat villainous plots and bring crooks to justice using illusions, tricks, gaslighting, manipulation, and just plain lies, which coincidentally is also how I ended up with a taste for broccoli.
Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to listen to some internet rando go on about an iconic television series that would later spawn an iconic movie franchise. This tape will self-destruct in about 50 years thanks to poor storage conditions and high humidity. Mission impossible.
It's a trick! Don't you see it's all a trick? You've got to believe me.
Mission Impossible was a television series broadcast by CBS from 1966 to 1973, where, for most of its run, it was a series about espionage-themed capers. But by the end of its run, had more or less become a crime drama.
I'm afraid we'll have to kill you both.
It's a show that's almost purely episodic, with almost no storylines that build on events from earlier episodes. There's almost no development for its regular characters, and very little humour.
Yes. No. Yes.
Most of the time it also lacks action scenes, shootouts, fistfights and car chases. I mean, there are some, but over time they would become quite rare. I mean, when you say it like that, it sounds about as exciting as being Kojak's barber.
Telly, why must you taunt me?
The show would run for 7 seasons, with some cast members going the distance and others only staying a year or two. There would be a revival series in the late 80s, and beginning in 1996, a big-budget feature series starring Tom Cruise, and whoever else was content to never ever ever make jokes about Scientology again.
Your mission, Jim, should you decide to accept it, is to put Corvin out of business for good. Destroy the satellite. Stop Stravos and end his murderous career. Bring Barrett to justice and recover the money. Totally discredit Fetchukov and his organization.
The Impossible Missions Force was a shadowy group given briefs to deal with problems that conventional intelligence or law enforcement agencies were unable to deal with. Things like preventing a foreign dictator from taking over or dealing with local organized crime. I mean, most of the time it's one or the other. The IM Force, of course, never has to deal with this.
Your mission, Jim, should you choose to accept it, is to find the jerk who scratched the word dickhead into the side of my brand new orange Dodge Challenger. I mean, I just got it waxed. This tape will follow my self-worth and self-destruct in 5 seconds.
Mission Impossible had a formula that was followed in the vast majority of episodes. The team leader receives a vague outline of a threat to national security or the rule of law, and it's up to them to formulate a plan and put together a team. Mission Impossible had regular characters, but we would end up knowing very little about them, apart from the fact that they could be some ruthless and cold-hearted bastards with nerves of steel, perfect reflexes, and who, thanks to some extra strong antiperspirant, often managed to remain relatively sweat-free, outside of a 5-second window before each commercial break.
I was a little hot under the collar. I feel better now.
The stories would mostly revolve around spy plots, recovering plans for deadly weapons, breaking people out of prison, toppling dictators, or preventing wannabe dictators from taking power, stopping enemy agents doing whatever.
Well, what's the charges?
For now, espionage.
Stories involving organized crime, often fighting the syndicate, would also be dotted throughout the series before becoming the dominant storyline in later years.
Does it look like Bush League?
So one week we'd be trying to find a nuclear bomb or stolen plutonium or something like that, and then the next week we're worried about a crooked fight promoter.
Is that clear? Is that clear? Yes!
Mission Impossible occasionally had action scenes like the fistfights, shootouts and car chases, but after the first year that sort of action would become sporadic rather than something you'd see every week. Instead, Mission Impossible was about tension. You had a briefing scene in the team lead's rather monochromatic apartment where parts of the plan would be discussed. Though viewers would have no context, you would have to pay very close attention to the episodes if you wanted to keep on top of what was going on. The fun was watching the IM Force's plan play out with its deliberate fake-outs, masks, gadgets, and much, much more. The cast would change regularly, with the series starting out with strategist Dan Briggs, the master of disguise Rollin Hand, the former model Cinnamon Carter, electronics expert Barney Collier, and strongman Willy Armitage. Briggs was later replaced by Jim Phelps, and later on Rollin and Cinnamon left, replaced by magician the Great Paris. Later on there was Dana Lambert, Dr. Doug Robert, and Lisa Casey. There were also a number of freelancers who would help out on a mission here and there.
Good morning, Mr. Phelps.
Most missions began with the iconic briefing, where the team lead would arrive at some innocuous location and collect a package with top-secret reference materials and often a recorded briefing. The voice is never identified in the series, but was provided by actor Robert Johnson.
As usual, should you or any member of your IM force be caught or killed, the Secretary will disavow any knowledge of your actions.
These briefing scenes were often shot in batches a few times each season. In early years, they were directed by series creator Bruce Geller, and occasionally the footage would be reused from episode to episode with a different voiceover and episode-specific insert shots.
This record will self-destruct in 5 seconds.
We'll come back to it later, but there are a few episodes where there are no briefings. But it was almost always the team lead receiving the briefing, apart from that one time that Cinnamon collected the mission details.
Good morning, Miss Carter.
There's the bit that everybody remembers.
This tape will self-destruct in 5 seconds.
From a purely practical point of view, these briefings do seem like they could go horribly wrong as far as their top secret nature went. I mean, just one bit of bad wiring or analog crosstalk, and then your cover's blown.
Good morning, Mr. Phelps. Your mission, Jim, should you decide to accept it, is to stop Sabatini and rescue Stefan, Francesca, and Nikolai.
Open channel D.
Hey, mate, someone order a cab for Covent Garden?
There was no typical Mission Impossible story, just lots of story types that would crop up again and again. That really wasn't the important bit. The good bit, the reason you watched, was to see how the IM Force's plan would shake out.
If you don't give me the sequence, I'm gonna pick one on a guess.
The pilot episode had the team steal 2 nuclear weapons stored in a hotel vault in a fictitious tin pot dictatorship country.
Rollin, you're getting every actor's dream. Chance to play a triple role. Mr. Lanier, Dominguez, and me.
Of course, it doesn't go according to plan when the team's safecracker injures himself, so team lead Dan Briggs has to take his place. After the pilot, there were many such heist-style episodes littered throughout early seasons. One where a trained cat has to steal something, another where they used a trained dog. And many times Barney would just have to drill through how many inches of concrete and steel to break into the most secure room on the planet, well, for that week.
When a man begins to doubt his own mind, you can make him believe almost anything, Cinnamon.
There are also many mind game episodes where the team go undercover to completely futz with people's brains in order to achieve their goal. The standard method was to infiltrate the villain's operation and manipulate their state of mind so that they would incriminate themselves in the eyes of their colleagues, or to basically frame the villain so that the colleagues took matters into their own hands. The number of episodic villains killed by their own people at the end of a show is somewhat higher than the number of times that I have broken a bone attempting to ski down a mountain on an inflatable sofa. You live and learn, and sometimes you don't.
You see how smart you are?
There were occasional postscript episodes, though often the villain would realize that they had been had, and then we cut to the end credits. All the villain's Confederates shot the villain.
Good shooting.
Thank you.
The team would slink out and occasionally slap themselves on the back in early seasons. On one occasion, Peter Graves let out a very small smile and received a note from Bruce Geller: "Don't editorialize." After that, if Jim Phelps held any sort of celebratory dance party at the end of a successful mission, then he did so on the inside. Later seasons, though, would see the team come in and give a wordless death stare to the defeated villain before heading off to a bar for margaritas and to set off firecrackers in an abandoned warehouse. Or so one assumes.
We've got a tennis court reserved for 5:30. We can just make it.
Prison breaks of various types were popular stories. Break out a resistance leader before they can be executed, that sort of thing. Or break someone out of an American prison out from under the noses of friendly law enforcement.
That makes it the year 2000, man.
And then there were the other sorts of mind games, and these tended to be the more memorable episodes. Those episodes where the team has to convince someone that they're not where they think they are, either in terms of time or a place. One episode has people convinced they're on a moving train, when they're of course not. Or in a submarine, when they're of course not. There's an episode where the team convinces a villain that they're in France but they're still in the US. The team convinces some people in a bunker that World War III has broken out. The team convinces somebody that they're actually in the past or have woken up in the future. One show convinces a villain that the US has been invaded. Another that he's woken up years after a nuclear war. There is so much gaslighting going on here that it's a wonder that they ever bothered to invent the incandescent bulb. Aside from the moral implications of an American team interfering with the affairs of other countries, both friendly and otherwise, there was the idea that some of these missions were just verging on overkill. I mean, Murder is bad. State-sanctioned political liquidations are morally repugnant.
You stupid flies!
But boy, would an assassin just be cheaper and way cooler. I mean, there's the sunglasses, the shaved heads, the diving sideways in slow motion while dual-wielding. Mission Impossible started with the studio needing a hit series and a writer who wanted to control their own work. Back in the 1950s, Lucille Ball and her then-husband Desi Arnaz had a hit series with I Love Lucy. They formed Desilu Productions, and one of their many investments was to buy up various studio facilities which they rented out to other producers. They also produced their own programs, such as The Untouchables and, of course, I Love Lucy. But by the early 60s, things had changed. After the couple's divorce, Lucille Ball bought out Arnaz's interest in the company. At the time, Desilu only had one in-house production on air, which was whatever Lucille Ball's current show on CBS was. So I had to check with several Lucy scholars from the Library of Lucille, and as it turns out, it was the Lucy Show. The studio really needed to sell more series that it owned, and so the search was on.
Throw blanket over viewer.
Desilu had produced a pilot for something called Star Trek in 1964, which didn't sell to the networks on its first try, but a second pilot was made, which did lead to a series order from NBC in 1966. I wonder what happened to that show. Probably nothing. I mean, the guy with the ears, he'll never work again.
Hardly seems likely.
Bruce Geller had been a writer with a varied resume, including work as a gag writer, working on musicals, a Flash Gordon television series, various westerns, and he had recently been a producer of western series Rawhide for one season. Bruce Geller had an idea called Briggs' Squad, which was a tightly plotted half-hour drama. 30-minute drama series had once been commonplace, but demand for the format had waned by the mid-60s, and Geller expanded his pilot script to an hour. Briggs' Squad as a title was a bit of a mouthful, something that rolled off the tongue about as smoothly as a chariot with square wheels being pulled by a single elderly King Charles Cavalier. The show, retitled Mission Impossible, was about a team of ex-criminal specialists who pulled off what would be a heist, but they were of course the good guys.
As always, you have carte blanche as to method and personnel.
Mission Impossible didn't materialize out of thin air, where it drew inspiration from the French heist film Rififi and Topkapi, a more breezy caper film. The original idea for the characters was that they would be a rough and tumble lot, former crooks and thieves.
You can't have an ace of clubs. I have one.
Geller had hoped to make it as a movie, but was pragmatic enough to know that he'd probably have to tone down the characters considerably if a television network sniffed around. When Geller's series was getting closer to a pilot, the more damaged aspects to the characters disappeared almost completely, like a futuristic hovering concept vehicle that suddenly has to fit mirrors, airbags, crumple zones, doors, and wheels to make it legally usable on a road. Also, by the mid-1960s, there was a great deal of demand for spy-themed programs in the wake of the success of the James Bond movies, where within the space of a few years, American television would be awash with series like The Man from U.N.C.L.E., I Spy, The Avengers and Get Smart. Desilu decided to get in on the act by making a pilot for Bruce Geller's Mission Impossible for CBS. CBS may have only considered the series in order to keep Lucille Ball happy and to keep her top-rated sitcom on their network.
All right, you all had time to think it over?
A reasonably expensive pilot was produced by Desilu in between production on Star Trek's two pilots. Of course, Desilu might be in a really tricky spot if these two expensive and complicated series sold at the same time. But what were the odds of that? And then, of course, that's exactly what happened, and now the fun would really begin. NBC picked up Star Trek, and CBS, possibly reluctantly, picked up Mission Impossible, both for the fall 1966 season. I remember when I sold a pilot called Captain Blighter to a television network. Boy, he was not happy. And then once production on the weekly series began, then the games really got started.
We plan it and we call the shots.
Mission Impossible, with its intricate plots, needed much longer to film than most television shows of the time. 1-hour shows often aimed for about 6 days of shooting, while Mission Impossible, with all of its extra setups required to tell the story, would take longer and longer, with shoots taking 7 to 9 days, often involving overtime. In order to keep things humming along, there was S&S, a skunkworks project headed by the post-production team. Saturday and Sundays was an unofficial second unit that would convene to shoot inserts and action scenes on weekends at a vastly reduced rate by masquerading as a unit shooting stock footage. Every close-up of somebody's hand pressing a button or rewiring something, or a shot of a clock counting down, or even things like a car chase would eventually be left by the main unit to be picked up by the S&S crew.
Even the picture is exciting.
When Mission Impossible first began, viewers were unused to the fast editing of Mission Impossible compared to other programs of the day. They would say Mission made them feel queasy. By the third season, when the series was hitting its heights of popularity, audiences had become used to the faster pace. Competitors and spoofs started to appear, but in general, Mission Impossible was a one-of-a-kind show.
But it rained yesterday, and there's a depression that usually fills with water around here.
And of all the shows that were greenlit during the spy boom, Mission Impossible would last the longest. This is despite the show being incredibly expensive and being owned by a studio desperate to get a return on its investment by selling it into syndication once it ended its run on CBS.
I want to dance the polka. I want to dance the... Not now.
The main characters in Mission Impossible are almost too perfect in that they have perfect reflexes, most of them can knock out somebody with a single perfectly placed chop to the shoulder, and they can all take a beating without even losing a filling. Every single one of them seems to be able to withstand all forms of interrogation and torture without breaking.
Get down! It's a bomb!
There are lots of uses for people with those skills, but for me, these are exactly the sorts of people who I want to organise the surprise party for Uncle Ron's birthday. You know, there'd be none of these unsubtle winks and giveaway tapping of the side of the nose, like with that idiot cousin Brad. Yeah, Brad, if you're so good at keeping secrets, how come your wife totally knows that those regular camping trips are actually casino trips? I mean, who the hell packs a tux with their fishing rods? Later on, the physical knockouts would be replaced by just pricking somebody with an instant sedative. I mean, if you wanted to knock me out, I really wouldn't need the sedative. Just plonk me on a couch and pop on a movie after 9 p.m.
I think that's very funny.
I don't find that amusing.
While Bruce Geller created the series and remained executive producer, the day-to-day running of the series was handed over to a number of producers during its run, starting with Joseph Gantman. Gantman in particular made the show work as a weekly production, aided by the writing team of William Reed Woodfield and Alan Balter, who would go on to write more Mission Impossible episodes in early years than anybody else. Geller himself would also oversee another Desilu series that sold for the 1967-68 season, Mannix, which was created by Columbo's originators William Link and Richard Levinson.
I'll tell you anything you want to know.
Later on, Mission Impossible would be taken over by Stanley Callis, Bruce Lansbury, and eventually Barry Crane.
But I know a good story when I hear one.
And you think this is a good story?
I know it is.
We could talk about all of the characters, but they weren't really regular characters in the way. They were more thumbnail sketches. In Mission Impossible, the members of the IM Force have almost no character apart from any roles that they play in the course of a mission. Any hint of the backstories, personal histories, likes, dislikes, families, etc. is rarer than a peanut M&M in a packet of Smarties. Some of the team had military service in their past. Barney boxed in the Navy and had a brother. Cinnamon is claustrophobic. Meanwhile, Paris's first and middle name is apparently The Great.
I hope it's welcome back, Dan. It's been a while.
The leader of the team during the show's first season was Dan Briggs. He'd arrive at some unusual location, collect a package containing briefing materials, and usually, but not always, some recording and some photographs.
How much are you gonna get for me, huh?
2 cents.
Briggs was rather ruthless in the way he conducted missions. He rarely showed much in the way of emotions, though he wasn't above threats.
I think you would.
You know I would.
He did, however, have people he cared for and friends.
Good luck, Dan.
Briggs would formulate a plan in his apartment which seemed to consist mainly of chain smoking while looking at pictures of potential operatives. Briggs was sometimes in the thick of the mission, but slowly during the first season, his appearances in episodes would reduce to almost nothing. And then absolutely nothing. Stephen Hill was a well-respected actor at the time, but had several things that worked against him as the star of a popular and complicated-to-shoot series. Firstly, some executives at CBS really did not like him and had wanted him replaced almost from the start. Secondly, he had acquired a reputation for being prickly to work with, where he sometimes flat-out refused to perform some scenes. And thirdly, his adherence to Orthodox Judaism meant that he would have to leave work early on a Friday in order to be home before sundown. Mission Impossible was a show where long hours were required to get the shows in the can, so for the show's producers, an absentee lead was more of a hindrance than a help. So Hill was at first suspended after refusing to work on a high platform, and then his role was cut down to almost nothing.
Yes, that's why I can't handle this mission personally.
Hill's biggest supporter had been executive producer Bruce Geller, but even Geller had to admit that Hill wasn't working, and the series lead was set to be recast for the show's second season.
Good luck. See you later.
Rollin Hand was a master of disguise, where he could mimic almost anyone when he needed to, whether it was just somebody's voice on the telephone or in person, where he's covered by a realistic mask.
Start nice and easy. Take all the time you need to build your performance.
Everybody's a critic.
Martin Landau had already turned down the chance to pop a Spock on it when he declined a role in Star Trek, and as his career was in a good place with both movie and television roles, he did not want to be tied down as a series regular. Thus his credit in the show's first year was as a special appearance, despite the fact that he really did take on major roles for the majority of episodes. Martin Landau's contract negotiations would often be handled by the actor taking a walk around the Desilu lot with executive Herb Solo, where by the end of the walk, the pair would have agreed to terms for Landau's involvement with the series for another year. However, despite the character's supporting role status and the idea that maybe Rollin wasn't in every episode, Rollin would quickly become one of the show's pivotal characters, and Martin Landau would often pick up the slack in episodes where Briggs's role was reduced.
Carl, examine the pool. No, I don't know what for. It could be anything. Just examine the pool.
Over 3 years, Rollin Hand seemed to smoke more than a chimney in a house where Santa really misjudged things.
What we are buying here is death. This instrument should provide the greatest amount of it.
Cinnamon Carter was a former model who, well, that's all we got. Her job was to be seductive when she needed to be, or austere, or authoritative, or gregarious.
No, that's absolutely out of the question. Cameras are strictly verboten in here.
There were occasionally subtle hints in some early episodes about something between Rollin and Cinnamon, but the show's lack of attachments meant that we'd never see a Cinnamon role.
I don't want to hear anything more about it.
Barbara Bain was a relative unknown when cast, even though she was married to Martin Landau at the time. Desilu Studios owner Lucille Ball had to give final approval for Bain's casting, where Bain would go on to win an Emmy for her portrayal of Cinnamon for each of her 3 seasons on the show.
We can afford to buy but one country at a time.
Barney Collier was an electronics and engineering genius who would devise many of the team's gadgets for a mission, and in several first-season installments would join the main team. However, his skills would soon see him spending a lot of time in, say, seasons 2 and 3 and 4, in long, wordless scenes where he's drilling into something, or digging, or cutting, or rewiring.
So I'll make sure that my feet never touch the floor.
Greg Morris would go on to appear in more episodes of the show than anybody else, and in later seasons there would be less and less of this backroom work during a mission, and Barney would again be undercover in many episodes, adopting an incredibly and possibly comically laid-back style compared to Barney's usual demeanor.
Well, not that it's any of your business, man.
Barney, of course, has some primo power tools, which are incredibly quiet and produce very little dust. Barney would also create any number of electronic gadgets from tiny transmitters to remote control devices. Sometimes the tech created for an episode was stretching the limits of credulity more than Reed Richards testing the warranty on a Stretch Armstrong toy.
All you have to do is shoot what goes on in the room on the 11th floor, and I'll move it optically to the 12th floor.
And at other times, the tech was remarkably prosaic. In one episode, Barney has to edit a videotape in exactly the same way videotapes were edited in the 1960s, where you physically cut the tape and spliced it back together again.
Name, rank, and serial number.
Willy Armitage was the team's strongman, played by bodybuilder and health fanatic Peter Lupus. Willy generally played small parts in most years, often assisting Barney with all of that digging, cutting, drilling, etc., or playing a small pivotal role, usually driving something. Willy speaking normally or Willy playing an undercover character often sounded the same.
The shortcut I took will get us to the cathedral before dusk.
It's only in later seasons that he would play a bigger part in the stories.
It weighs over 90 pounds.
I have to move naturally.
No problem.
Peter Lupus had already starred in some Italian-made sword and sandals movies where he was billed as Rock Stevens, because apparently the stage name Rock Hard may have possibly been in use by another actor.
We're moving in. We're going to take over your organization.
And of course, after the series, he would become quite well known to comedy aficionados from his appearances in Police Squad. Despite his size, he often had to play characters who couldn't just pick up a villain and snap their spine like a twig. It is often amusing to see some pipsqueak henchman manhandling our Big Willy. Man, there has to be a better way to say these things.
It must be ready to blow.
The IM Forces assignments would take them all over the United States and around the world. While there were a few assignments set in real countries, France, Britain, Japan, the vast majority of overseas assignments took place in a made-up country, somewhere in, say, South America, sometimes in Africa or the Middle East, but many, and probably most, took place in a vaguely Eastern European country. Here's a map of Europe in the 1960s. And here's a map of Europe with all of the fake countries shown in Mission Impossible.
Nothing vague about that, huh?
In Mission Impossible, the United Nations building in New York City would have required a second tower just to accommodate all of the extra flags.
Oh, what's the difference? It's all over. Let us go. We'll leave the country.
Perhaps. After you tell me Picard's plan.
It's a television show, so everybody speaks English, even in the overseas set episodes, with the IM Force shown to be speaking any language perfectly by putting on an accent. Any accent, it doesn't matter.
I'm authorized to offer you $1 million.
It is a fact.
Too much learning undermines a man's loyalty.
As rare an item as any coin collector ever laid eyes on.
The made-up foreign language used for signage in various mock Eastern Bloc countries was nicknamed Gillarese.
That's right, mate.
One place Mission Impossible rarely went near was Southeast Asia, where the US was involved in the Vietnam War. Now, as far as I can make out, that conflict was only mentioned once in an episode where, of course, as was the style at the time, a returned vet with PTSD was possibly a serial killer.
He was with the 1st Division in Vietnam.
Mission Impossible's first season was not a huge rating smash, but CBS renewed the series for a second season.
Good morning, Mr. Phelps.
Season 2 was where Mission Impossible gained one of its most familiar images, that of the new team leader, Jim Phelps, played by Peter Graves. Phelps was just there with no explanation, which was a thing with cast changes on Mission Impossible. The character would lead the series for 6 years, and over those seasons, we would learn that he served in the Korean War, came from a small town, and that we could work out what season of the show we were watching by just how white his hair had become.
Quick, make him give me back my gun.
Compared to his predecessor, Phelps would often play major characters on most missions, where my favourite is the surly arsehole character he would assume on many missions.
Now I say, set him up!
And the least favourite was the one where they turned him into this. As a result, Jim Phelps rarely used masks or makeup when going undercover.
Oh, look, I don't want you to worry. They start shooting tomorrow morning. Why don't you come down and have a look for yourself?
We rarely saw much of the mechanics of planning missions outside of a scene where Phelps examined dossiers. But one episode did show Phelps as the master planner and as someone who could crack codes.
You may not know me, but you certainly know my merchandise.
Prior to joining Mission Impossible, Peter Graves had starred in several movies and a few series made outside of the US. His brother was James Arness, the star of the long-running western Gunsmoke. But Graves as Phelps has become indelibly linked with the image of that guy from Mission Impossible. Oh, and Captain Nova.
You like movies about gladiators?
The rest of the cast were the same, just with Martin Landau being credited as a series regular. Season 2 was where Mission Impossible went from just being some interesting series that baffled and confused some viewers to a show where people were glued to their sets, which also may explain why TV dinners consisting solely of flour and water were banned from sale.
Well, then we're all set. Except for the typhoid. Who's got it?
Ratings in Season 1 had seen the show doing only slightly better than Desilu's stablemate Star Trek, while Season 2 saw a marked improvement in the show's viewing numbers. Season 2 of Mission Impossible seemed less tentative and more confident. The tacked-on shootouts and fistfights happened less and less, and the show relied more on the inherent tension of the mission. The show's formula had settled into mainly spy-based thrills with regular episodes involving organised crime. Capers and heists abounded. But you know, it was the good guys defeating the bad guys. One mission was written to feature a trained cat, which as a cat owner strains credulity when it doesn't hiss the entire time and stop and randomly preen itself during the mission.
Come over here and we'll talk.
All right, Louisa. Come over here and we'll talk.
Mission Impossible often went wildly over the studio set budget in Geller and Gantman's quest to make a great show. However, there was a cloud on the horizon, or actually a mountain. During the show's second year, the 1967-68 season, Lucille Ball's sale of Desilu to Paramount was completed, which would begin to impact Mission Impossible over the course of the third season. Paramount quickly rebranded Desilu as its television division, but the studio immediately set about reining in costs of its programs, due partly to a string of underperforming feature films at the time, and partly because Desilu's original deal with CBS meant that there was a large deficit between the licensing fee paid by the network to show the series and the actual cost of a Mission Impossible episode. Star Trek was an expensive show, but not a particularly highly rating show, and so the producers on that show had little choice but to accept the more restrained budgetary environment, to keep to their budgets and stick to a 6-day shooting schedule. Mission Impossible, on the other hand, was considered more of a success, and CBS would often side with the show's producers in budget battles.
It's a good deal.
While Paramount was trying to rein in costs, the Impossible Missions Force had no such budgetary restrictions, with Phelps' plans, well, the nicest way of saying it is they often took the long way around. As such, a breakdown of Impossible Missions Force costs is quite instructive. There was the cost of all the raw materials, the cost of expensive one-piece masks that looked and felt like the real thing, all the fake blood, foreign uniforms, voice coaches so that the team's foreign accents were bulletproof.
Yeah, I ain't gonna believe this.
Things like ancillary items like all the drill bits that Barney has to go through. And of course there's the business of faking nuclear attacks or making people think that they're in a submarine. That's not a cheap business. But the biggest single cost seems to be blank tape and playback devices, where instead of reusing the device or the tape, we just blew them up. They destroyed reel-to-reel players, cassette players, speakers, film projectors, payphones, dictaphones, turntables, whatever. Clearly, this is the start of the death of physical media. By the third season, the show was an unqualified hit, often appearing in the top 10 of programs. The show's two most prolific writers of the first two seasons, William Reed Woodfield and Alan Walter, succeeded Joseph Gantman as producers, but they would soon exit after butting heads with Bruce Geller. They'd eventually be replaced by Stanley Callis, though finding writers who could put together satisfying and logical plots was tough. Despite the turmoil involved in getting scripts ready for production, the third season of Mission Impossible was possibly the most inventive and certainly the most watched year of the show, and it's probably where the show hit its peak creatively. However, in the background, Paramount now had their own man in charge of production, Douglas Kramer, whose job it was to get the costs down in the television division.
They've got to be stopped.
When Martin Landau was ready to negotiate for a fourth season, Herb Solo was no longer there to take a walk around the lot with Landau. Instead, Kramer would balk at the numbers that Landau's agent asked for, not least because it would also trigger a big salary bump for the series star Peter Graves. And so, rather than follow his predecessor's lead and just have a casual chat with the actor while walking around the studio, Kramer would rather the actor took a running jump through a window. Likewise, rather than negotiate in good faith with Barbara Bain,
I'm willing to make a deal.
The studio engineered her departure as well. CBS were annoyed at losing the Landau Bains, or the Baindows, and they were also pretty pissed off at the very pointless and incredibly petty way that the popular pair ended up leaving the hit show. For the show's fourth season, there might just have to be some cast changes. You think? Firstly, as Star Trek had ended with its third season in 1969, Leonard Nimoy was sounded out about joining Mission Impossible as a new master of disguise. Nimoy was now free, and after conferring with his friend Martin Landau, Nimoy accepted the role of Paris, the master magician, where he was apparently paid way more than he was on Star Trek.
I will try to remember that.
The great Paris started off as a find and replace for Rollin Hand, though over time, the character's importance to the team and the missions seemed less and less. His skills, though, were exactly the same as Rollin's, and the magic part didn't seem to come into play all that often. We would occasionally see Paris in between missions, and on a few occasions see his normal persona, which was quite laid back and chill.
Tell Jim I dig old hometowns if he needs me.
Also, over time, the production would find it easier to have another actor play the impersonated character that Paris was playing, and so Nimoy's opportunities for playing different characters were often limited.
Oh, no. I couldn't do that.
And in some episodes, Paris is just there as another pair of hands, rather than any major part of the plot. Hiring a permanent female agent was complicated by parts of Barbara Bain's contract, and also by the fact that they couldn't find anyone as perfect for the role as Barbara Bain had been. Instead, Season 4 would have a succession of women joining the team for an episode here and there, with Lee Merriweather appearing several times. Lee Merriweather seemed a good fit for a replacement character for Bain, but for whatever reason did not become a cast regular. Paramount had finally found itself a producer who would have their back in Bruce Lansbury.
What he really wants is to cut our price,
He'd previously worked on Wild Wild West, which before his tenure had seen a revolving door of producers. He was seen as a stable and safe pair of hands for a show that was still rating quite well. Wild Wild West proved a good training ground for Mission Impossible, as that show was also a complicated spy series. The fourth season of Mission Impossible went fairly overboard in overseas espionage missions, the majority of which were set in a fake Eastern European country, but it was all mainly shot in and around the studio lot. Coincidentally, Uncle Reg was also once on the Paramount lot, where he was at first lit and then shot, but there were no cameras or lights to be seen.
Come off it, mate. Not very likely, huh?
Mission Impossible had done two-part stories, though only one of them ended up being released as a feature in overseas markets. The fourth season went one better and produced a three-part epic, The Falcon, which is relatively enjoyable, but it does seem like it's stretching out a basic idea just a little too far, like that stick of chewing gum you started on 70 days ago. This would also end up being the last multi-episode story for the show. In its fourth season, Mission Impossible was suddenly no longer the draw that it was. The public had noticed the change in the series, and the show's ratings took a big dive. As it turns out, Landau and Bain were much bigger draws than Paramount's executive Douglas Kramer was prepared to publicly admit.
Yes, I know. We found that out.
The show was never quite the same in the eyes of the viewing public, but for Paramount, new producer Lansbury had mostly gotten control of the show's runaway budgets and shooting schedules. There was another casualty of this power shift. Mission Impossible creator Bruce Geller was now, in effect, a figurehead with no real power over the series. He would be credited as executive producer for the rest of the show's run, but very quickly he'd leave Paramount to work at another studio.
And before I tell you what your mission is, here's a short word from our sponsor, Ovaltine. Wait a minute!
The fifth season saw Mission Impossible subtly reboot itself. Graves, Morris and Nimoy were now joined by a pair of 20-something operatives, including a new permanent female team member played by a very serious and very young Lesley Warren. Producer Lansbury also couldn't work out why Willy was there and attempted to phase out the Willy. There would be a Willy in some episodes, but no Willy in other episodes. So if you wanted Willy in the episode, you'd have to toss for it. Oh man.
Oh, they'd have to be much more subtle.
In the Willy-free episodes, the team was joined by a resident doctor, Doug Robert, played by Sam Elliot in an early TV role. The tone of the show would shift from being almost pure espionage towards featuring more and more episodes dealing with a mainly US-set criminal enterprise. Mission Impossible still dealt with missile bases and spies, but now those sorts of episodes rubbed shoulders with gangsters and local corrupt officials.
We are through playing the game according to your foolish code.
Mission Impossible went street level, with the stakes of some episodes being much smaller, with more local threats, rather than those with the usual vague geopolitical ramifications of so many episodes in the first 4 seasons. There would also be a taster of where the series was going in the future.
Disneyland?
Oh, hush you. And while the season wasn't necessarily a creative high point, it did mix things up a lot for a show in its 5th year.
Well, what am I to do with the thing?
From season 1, there had been occasional episodes that, for one reason or another, did not feature the traditional opening, so no briefing or spontaneously combusting tapes. In many of these, the mission was more of a personal nature, where someone extorts Dan into carrying out a mission, or an off-duty Phelps was drugged after wandering into the middle of some dastardly plot in a small town. Phelps rescues a friend wrongfully imprisoned overseas, or Cinnamon is captured during a mission. Barney's accused of murder and sentenced to death, that sort of thing. For the 5th year, these non-standard missions would seem to feature in what seemed like half of the shows this season. Things will more often go wrong for the team, like a lot. Barney is wounded on a couple of occasions. Paris was captured between missions and programmed to kill Jim Phelps. Phelps returns to his hometown and finds that there's a serial killer on the loose. Barney takes down the villains who killed his brother. Paris is mistaken for an American businessman and kidnapped. Dana is captured during a mission, and so on. And on the more standard missions, the team just have to think on their feet more often when things just don't go so well. So, when I said earlier that I wanted the IM Force to plan a surprise party for Uncle Ron, I didn't mean this lot, since statistically, something is likely to go majorly wrong and Uncle Ron would probably end up trapped in a room with poison gas. Now, Aunt Doris would probably say that she has to endure that every time Ron has sausages for dinner. On occasions though, the IM Force's missions would need extra manpower with extra operatives here and there, and occasionally the team would use a group of extras to help out. By the 4th and 5th year, these extras would be used more and more. Very few have any sort of personality, and very few are given many lines, but they do make some of the more outlandish plots work a little bit better than just having 4 or 5 people playing multiple roles in an episode.
I spy with my little eye something beginning with T.
Bruce Geller may have left the Paramount lot, though the production team still carried on the production the way that he wanted, which would occasionally frustrate Bruce Lansbury's attempts to control the show's budget. 2 younger cast members had been introduced to try and appeal to a younger audience. Sam Elliot had been given a role with less meat than a chicken nugget. Lesley Ann Warren fared a little better, where she plays the character very seriously for the most part, only occasionally dipping into the breathless, possibly slightly drunk persona she would play in so many later roles.
Surely you didn't expect me to bring the negative here.
When both characters vanished without explanation, there were no search parties sent out, and neither ended up on the side of a milk carton.
Then he and I sneak away, leaving the gun and the kids behind.
There was talk of killing off Dana on screen, but nothing eventuated. Sam Elliot appeared in roughly half the season's episodes, but there was an outcry about the lack of Willy. Fans were upset at the total lack of Willy, and they really wanted the Willy back. They were hungry for Willy, just ravenous to see more Willy. Eventually the audience won out, and Peter Lupus quickly returned to the show, while Doug disappeared with even less fanfare than when he had first appeared.
Beautiful.
For a show where we have very few looks into the personalities and emotions of the main characters, there was one area where the facades were dropped. Romances in a spy caper often started off as part of a honey trap where one of the team has to seduce a villain. Occasionally, though, things would go a little south when the team member gets a little too close to the mark. The drama is now whether the team member can get through the mission. Cinnamon may have fallen for a target, and later so did Paris. Phelps became attached to a double agent. Some of these episodes with doomed romances can veer awfully close to the realms of comedy, as in the romance part is so over the top with super syrupy music and romantic montages.
Autumn's my favorite season.
Actual relationships were rare, but did happen from time to time. Barney was allowed to have a non-work related girlfriend in one episode, but then he's accused of murdering a corrupt official and condemned to death. We've all had first dates like that.
This watch face has a little window, which normally gives the date. But in this case, it will give the winning number.
Several missions involve the team, well, the technical term is cheating like a cheating cheater, at things like sports and gambling. Several missions are set in a casino where the team will take liberties with the rules of poker, blackjack, roulette, craps, baccarat, snap, happy families, Uno, and more. It's not just games of chance. The IM Force will cheat at horse racing, pool, boxing. If it's something that I have lost a lot of money on, then the IM Force has been at it. I swear that's why every time I try my infallible system at the gaming tables, these jokers show up to bollocks up my streak.
Paris, I'm sorry. I can't fix it. You're on your own.
Anyway, that's enough grievances. They just better keep their cheating asses away from Magic the Gathering.
How'd you know my name? Oh, yeah, I told you.
Mission Impossible episodes may have been set all over the world, but the vast majority of the series was filmed in and around Los Angeles, with only a few locations further afield, such as San Francisco in the final year. Whenever possible, the series was filmed on the standing backlot sets. And when that wasn't enough, the exterior of the sound stages themselves doubled for any number of foreign military bases.
I am leaving.
After 2 seasons, Leonard Nimoy had decided that Mission Impossible was not for him, and so you can see how the series didn't really know what to do with Paris. Compared to Rollin Hand, who was one of the main players in nearly every mission, the Paris character is used far more sporadically. Now, there are shows where it's all about Paris. There are shows where he's just supporting the main plot, but there are also a fair few where he's basically Willy's assistant.
Paris, you and Willy stay here and cover the exits.
In many episodes where Paris would wear another person's face, the character would be played for the bulk of the episode by another actor, while Nimoy would turn up at the end to rip off the mask. Nimoy had said that he had a lot of time on his hands while filming Mission Impossible, so I'm guessing that the 2 years he was on the series would have been a very good time to challenge Leonard Nimoy to a weekday round of golf. Nimoy understandably grew frustrated by the lack of development for Paris. It's little things like playing another character whose boss's name was Jim.
Yes, Jim.
There was also the constant replaying of character types that seemed to cycle around every few months. Old man, torture victim, a military officer wearing a slightly different uniform.
What are you doing, mate?
There's Leonard Nimoy, the famous Japanese actor. There's Leonard Nimoy, the famous Latin American actor. Leonard Nimoy, the famous Middle Eastern actor.
But I could bring it around this Arvo.
And most egregious of all for this channel, Leonard Nimoy, the famous Australian actor.
If that coin's not fair dinkum, then I didn't know it. I swear, I didn't know it.
So far, conventional law enforcement agencies have been unable to interfere with their operations.
Season 6 returned with a slimline quartet as the main team. There was Jim, there was Barney, and Willy, who would now get up to and including a dozen lines per episode.
Paul's got the flu. I'm Albert, his nephew. And you must be Mr. Kroll.
They were now joined by Casey, played by Lynda Day George. Casey's specialty was that she was a woman, and also a master of disguise. Or is that a mistress of disguise, which I now admit is something I would like to hear much more about.
I don't know what you're talking about.
Almost, but not 100% completely gone for this season, espionage plots in the vast majority of episodes. Casey would get to do a lot of mask tearing off in many episodes where she was in fact played by another actress, but she did at least get to jump through a window on her own. Casey also went undercover in many missions where, like the rest of the team, she can take a hit. She also produced masks for Barney on occasion, as well as several of the freelancers brought on for various missions. The missions were now almost exclusively variations on putting somebody high up in the criminal syndicate out of business because conventional law enforcement was unable to do so. And so now Mission Impossible was no longer a spy series, it had become a 70s crime drama series. So instead of missile plans and secret formulae, plots involved money laundering, gambling and the like. We were putting the syndicate's top man out of action every week, but man, these guys are like Hydra, cut off one head and there's a season's worth of villains to replace them. At the very least, we still had people jumping through windows. The series' ratings had slumped markedly in the 4th season, but had rebounded somewhat in the 5th and 6th years of the show. There was still life in the old dog yet. Paramount, though, was looking at its watch, waiting, drooling over the prospect that Mission Impossible would one day be cancelled by CBS, and so that the studio could finally sell the series into syndication.
I think that could be arranged.
They would no longer be losing money by licensing the show to CBS, and those syndication sales would finally see Mission Impossible making money for the studio.
I need the dough.
So CBS renewed the series for a 7th year. Season 7 continued with the style of Season 6 with the same basic team, though Lynda Day-George was pregnant during production of many episodes and was replaced in a few episodes by Barbara Anderson playing Mimi and a few others. Mimi actually has a backstory. She helped out the team on a mission while on parole and had her sentence reduced as a result. On-screen character development for a main character on Mission Impossible was about as rare as that local ice cream truck that plays Smoke on the Water. Hang on, I'll be right back, I'm just getting a purple soft serve. Season 7 again consisted mostly of the IM Force bringing organised crime lords to justice. Whereas in earlier years the IM Force would quietly slip away at the end of the episode, we now have the crooks being arrested by law enforcement, and Phelps, Barney, Casey and Willy would show up to wordlessly acknowledge their victory before leaving together.
I'm melting! I'm melting!
Peter Graves did manage to direct an episode where Phelps is kidnapped while playing tennis with Barney, which, as it goes, is a pretty good excuse for not paying the club's membership fees.
I didn't kill Johnny. You know I didn't.
Sorry, Eve, we know you did.
I did feel that in the last 2 seasons, stories would unfold very slowly and then wrap up very quickly in the last 3 minutes, where almost every episode repeated the same old ploy again and again. Make one crook from a set of crooks think another crook from their crook coterie was stealing from them. And unlike previous years where the crooks ended up killing each other, now they were arrested, providing defense attorneys and appeals court lawyers, and by extension Mercedes dealers, a lot of employment. Ratings had slipped quite markedly in the 7th season, where it was the lowest average, but cancellation was by no means certain. However, rather than wait for CBS to make up its mind, Paramount decided that mission was done, and so in 1973, Mission Impossible ended its first run on CBS. Paramount could finally get some of that sweet syndication money, which they would then just blow on lottery tickets.
Name your price. You just paid it.
Mission Impossible, though, would never go away, living on in reruns, and it would be referenced in television and other media for years after its original run had ended.
This isn't going to self-destruct in 15 seconds, is it?
I came into Mission Impossible well after the series' original run, where for years I had never seen it, but it would be mentioned in some movie or show, and then sometime in the mid-80s, Mission Impossible was actually repeated in an afternoon slot on a local channel where they would usually show something like The Rockford Files or Barnaby Jones or whatever. Of course, it was usually screened during school hours, so I'd only be able to catch episodes during school holidays. So the episodes that I saw were from what I now know to be the show's last 2 years. But it was still a really cool thing. Looking back, I suppose I probably could have just taped it off television, but I think I was worried about the VCR blowing up. In the following decades, I'd see an episode here and there, but it wasn't until around 2010, 2011 that I finally got to sit down and watch the entire series from start to finish. Now, I still like it, though there are eras that work better for me than others. The classic era really has to be seasons 2 and 3. though there are brilliant ploys and plots throughout the show's run. Mission Impossible has one of the most famous theme tunes of not just the 1960s, but any decade. Composer Lalo Schifrin had written what he considered a throwaway music cue for the pilot episode, but it was liked so much by producers that it became the show's theme tune. Mission Impossible was relatively unique in that it's an odd time signature, 5/4 time.
Dig, fellas, this is it. Let's do it like we rehearsed it, okay?
It's odd if you usually listen to pop or rock music. The theme tune has been heard a million times and parodied in dozens of movies and television shows. It's almost unmistakable for anything else. When a new version of the theme tune was introduced in the 5th season, not a new theme, just a new recording of the theme, it proved unpopular enough for producers to revert to a slightly edited version of the original recording for the show's 6th year. The show's final year featured another new recording of Schifrin's famous tune. Aside from the theme tune, Mission Impossible also has one of the most famous pieces of television music that is not a theme tune. The plot is a march that features in most episodes of the TV series, and like the theme tune, is heard occasionally in the feature films. Other composers contributed to the series and had their work tracked across multiple episodes, but the Mission Impossible theme tune just sticks in your ear like a Q-tip coated in superglue. Just as the show's visual style evolved, so did the music. Early on, it featured a jazzier style, while later seasons augment that style with funkier sounds, more bass guitars and rock drums. So while Mission Impossible sounded fantastic, it also looked amazing, where, thanks to Bruce Geller's insistence, quality was, for a long time, the goal, rather than trying to dash out an episode as quickly as possible. Even in the later years when the show's production had been more streamlined, Mission Impossible often looked like it was made with a lot of care and attention. The acting was almost always top-notch, and the photography excellent. It rarely looked like a cheap show, even in later years, when it's not quite in the same league as the earlier years. Of course, in a show that actually doesn't have all that much action in most episodes, there was the problem for whoever was cutting together the show's iconic title sequence each week, which was of course different for every episode. So in many episodes, every single whip, pan or crash zoom would end up in that week's intro. It was always fun trying to work out how all of these clips would play out in the episode that followed. If you're a fan of Mission Impossible's sister series Star Trek, you could be forgiven for thinking that a lot of the guest stars in Trek also appeared on Mission Impossible around the same time. Desilu casting director Joseph D'Agosta offered some actors' agents a deal whereby they would get 3 guaranteed guest appearances in Desilu shows in return for a discounted fee for the studio. So while we're not going to stop and point out every guest actor who appeared in Star Trek and Mission Impossible, just know there was a lot of overlap on the casting side. Mission Impossible would also rehire character actors for roles in the series time and time again. Some actors seemed to pop up each season playing a different character. There was the mix of familiar character actors, people who were well known at the time, or would become well known later on. But just to pick a few at random, there's Eartha Kitt, Dean Stockwell, Martin Sheen, Anthony Zerbe, Robert Conrad, Mark Leonard, Ricardo Montalban, George Stanford Brown, Jack Cassidy, Sugar Ray Robinson, Roddy McDowell, Jessica Walter, Darren McGavin, Tyne Daly, Dana Elkar. Well, the guest star list in Mission Impossible is longer than the hairs in Cousin It's hairbrush.
Your mission, should you choose to accept it.
One thing that Mission Impossible never makes clear, just what happens if Jim chooses not to accept the mission.
Well, fine then. Don't accept the mission. See if I care.
There are a lot of episodes of Mission Impossible, and they can sometimes blur into one another, so I won't go into a list of the best and worst, but I will briefly talk about the seasons and a few installments of each year that I think merit a mention. The first season did tend to have the widest variety of missions, where the show's writers and producers were trying to find out what worked and what didn't. There are many episodes where the full team isn't used most of the time.
This is the most beautiful mission I've ever been on.
Ransom was the first off-book mission where Dan Briggs has to spring a witness under police protection in order to save his friend's daughter who's being held hostage by a gangster. The Train has the conceit of people thinking they're on a train where the window is just a back projection screen. A few episodes deal with the return of Nazis, and never has seeing someone being shot in Mission Impossible been so satisfying. Season 2 had The Town, where Phelps accidentally stumbled onto a plot by foreign agents who've taken over a small town. Phelps has been put in a catatonic state and has to communicate with Rollin with eye blinks. The Seal had Darren McGavin defeated by a cat. And it's an orange cat, no less. The photographer had the IM Force fake a nuclear attack in order to break an enemy code. Charity had the gag of stealing a crook's pile of precious metals by melting it down and leaving behind an inflatable copy. In Season 3, Jim Phelps is shot on a mission and falls for an agent played by Joan Collins. The freeze made a crook think he's awoken in the future, past the statute of limitations of his crimes. There are several exciting installments where the team will infiltrate a military facility of a foreign power. The Mind of Stefan Miklos was a classic, where the IMF attempt to outplay a genius foreign spy. The exchange had Cinnamon captured during a mission, and the team have to break out a prisoner from a friendly government in order to exchange for Cinnamon. In Season 4, the team had to make some more damned Nazis think they're on a doomed U-boat. Parrish pretends he's a robot in one episode, and an Australian in another.
Have a deco at this.
Thankfully, he's never given an episode where he has to play a robot Australian, because while Aussie automatons don't expect a tip, they do get incredibly stroppy if you don't want to talk to them about the footy. In The Crane, a wanted resistance leader is hidden under the noses of his former captors by the team hiding him in a tub suspended by a crane. Season 5 opened with a killer who leaves everything to chance, and the IM Force had minutes to create a hotel that he's picked at random. Butterfly does a semi-convincing version of Japan, apart from the not at all convincing Leonard Nimoy as a famous Japanese kabuki artist, and Japan being full of left-hand drive cars. Decoy is amazing purely because of the amazing go-kart that Phelps uses to get somebody through a heavily guarded border crossing. Season 6 begins with Blind, where Phelps goes blind for a mission. Now that's dedication for you. Double Dead because Willy suddenly has a much bigger role after he's injured and captured on a mission. Casino because it has Barney breaking into a crooked casino vault and taking the villain's cash with a vacuum. Now it's obviously a very special vacuum because mine complains every time it scoops up so much as a 50-cent coin. Season 7 saw Vic Morrow convinced he'd survived a nuclear war and that it was now the year 2000. Kidnap was a sequel of sorts to the previous year's Casino story, where Phelps is captured by associates of the earlier episode's villain. Season 7's tweaks to the IM Forces versus Crooks formula were relatively minor, though towards the end of the year, the epilogues explaining parts of the plot or their consequences did not really fit well with the series' established style. Despite a couple of interesting episodes, the final year really did feel like the writers and producers were running on fumes, and not good fumes, like living near incense testing facilities.
Cut it, print.
After Mission Impossible, Stephen Hill dropped out of acting for many years, though eventually he'd start appearing on television roles, including a stint on Law & Order. Martin Landau and Barbara Bain would star in the British-made science fiction series Space 1999 in the mid-70s. Greg Morris would appear in many guest shots and appeared as a regular on the series Vegas. Peter Lupus and Lynda Day George would also pop up in guest roles here and there. Sam Elliot and Lesley Ann Warren didn't do too badly after Mission Impossible. And as for Leonard Nimoy, well, he was never ever heard from again. Too bad. I like that guy. Peter Graves would appear in many guest roles and also appeared in a film that he thought was going to be terrible, but would also turn out to be one of his most iconic roles. And then there was Mission Impossible again. Mission Impossible's creator, Bruce Geller, died in a light plane crash in 1978, around the same time that development work had begun on a revival of sorts. Mission Impossible 1980 didn't get too far along before it was quietly put aside. Through the 80s there was a possibility of a remake, but then the Writers Guild of America looked like they were going to strike in the late 80s, and so US network ABC ordered a remake series from Paramount. Originally, the new Mission Impossible was meant to mainly repurpose original series scripts, with the same characters continuing, though with possible recasting. In the end, only a few scripts were recycled, and new characters would be created to work alongside Jim Phelps, played by a returning Peter Graves, in a show that would be made in Australia. Greg Morris and Lynda Day George would each make guest appearances reprising their original roles, with Robert Johnson again providing the briefing voice at the start of most episodes.
This disc will self-destruct in 5 seconds.
The remake lasted 2 seasons, so that's something we'll likely look at separately. All throughout the 80s and early 90s, there was also the idea of a Mission Impossible movie. When Mission Impossible was finally released in 1996, it kick-started a movie franchise that has become a massive success in its own right, even if some installments are better than others.
Now wait a minute.
Mission Impossible is an entertaining series where a group embraced the idea of using a sledgehammer to speed up the making of an omelette. But not literally, because that really would have messed up those nice suits. The overkill and over-elaborate spy capers gave way to smaller, more personality-based mind fornication of crooks and gangsters. Yet Mission Impossible will always have you humming the theme tune whenever you light a fuse in a stick of dynamite. What, is that just me? If you enjoyed this review, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.
This message will self-destruct in 5 seconds. Wait, no. Better make that 10 seconds. Or 15 seconds. Well, this is embarrassing. While I have you, I just wanted to take this chance to talk to you about a fabulous investment opportunity where instead of costing you money, it will make you money. It's really simple. All you have to do is